Okay, everyone, here we are with chapter one of our textbook. In this set of slides, we'll talk about the 10 principles that Mankiw thinks are important for economists to know, the 10 principles that underlie all our thinking about economics. And so in this chapter, we will do that. We'll talk about what economics can tell us about how people make decisions, how they interact with each other, not socially, but in terms of buying and selling things, whether it's goods or services or labor, time, right? You're going to eventually have the opportunity to sell your time or rent your time. Why do you decide to work the amount of time that you do? How much work, how much of your labor do you wish to sell? That's an economic decision. Um, Another economic decision is, well, why do you work in the first place? Or put another way, why did you decide to come to school instead of working? Right? Those are economic decisions. We'll talk about how that works. Right? And eventually we'll get to a conversation about how the economy works as a whole. Right? So the problem in economics generally, the thing that makes this uh, discipline interesting and the thing that we struggle with is the fact, the recognition that resources are scarce. And when I say scarce, I don't mean not there's not a lot of it. I mean it's finite, right? There's not enough. We don't have an infinite amount of money. We don't have an infinite amount of time. We don't have an infinite amount of resources, right? There's not enough of the stuff we need to satisfy everyone, right? What that stuff is depends on who you are, right? For people, it's time. Right. At the end of the day, what we do to make a living is to sell our time and our expertise in exchange for money. And when we do that, we get money to buy the stuff we want. We don't have enough time, usually, to sell in exchange for money, which means we don't have enough money. We don't have enough money. We don't have the money we need to buy all the things we want. How do we balance the need for the stuff we want, our consumption, with the time that we have to earn money to do that, right? That goes to the fact that time is a finite resource. For businesses, what's a finite resource is also money. It's profits, right? So a business wants to make as much profit as it can. How does it do that? Well, it needs to sell things, and it needs some things to make the things it sells. It needs what we call inputs. Right, and those inputs could be different things. It could be depending on the business or depending on the product. It could be labor or capital. We'll explain what that is. That has a very special meaning in economics, or raw materials. How does a business figure out how to use the inputs available to it to make the most profit? Right. So that all this stuff is a lead up to principle number one. But before we get to that, I want to just talk about sort of an example that I will propose to use throughout the course when we're talking about the behavior of businesses. It'll help you guys understand or maybe take a little bit of the stuff out of the abstract to understand what we're talking about, right? So we're talking about inputs, right? And we're talking about businesses. So what is a typical business that needs these resources, needs inputs? Well, for you folks who are American, you may know my friend Buddy Valastro. He is a baker who has a store in Hoboken, New Jersey, and other places. He also has a TV show, which is kind of funny. What the premise of this TV show is, he's got all these wacky employees working for him. He's got a wacky family. They do all kinds of interesting things, and it's kind of funny. At the end of the day, though, they make these really cool cakes. So let's say, for example, you like to play golf. He might make a golf course cake for you with a putting green and golf clubs and a golf ball, that sort of stuff. So take a look at the video. That YouTube video gives you an example of what he does. But also, I want to use Buddy as an example of a typical business that needs inputs to make his product, which is cakes, right, to make a profit. So think about Buddy. Again, he makes cakes. What does he need to make those cakes? He needs labor, right? He needs workers to help him make the cakes. He needs ingredients to make the cakes. So he needs milk and eggs and flour and sugar and that sort of stuff. He needs some machines, right? He needs mixers. He needs tools, utensils. He needs ovens. Perhaps he needs a truck to deliver the cakes to the customer when they're made. He needs a factory or a bakery, right? He needs a bunch of things. Right. So when we're talking about inputs, think of Buddy and think of the inputs that he needs to make his products. That may help sort of take this a little bit out of the abstract. Right. So here we are. How people make decisions. Right. Principle number one, people face trade-offs. Right. They have to make a choice. Do I go to a party the night before an exam or do I study, right? That's a trade-off. If you go to the party, you don't have the time to study. If on the other hand you study, you don't go to the party. You have to make a choice here, right? Number two, right? If you want to buy more stuff, if you want an iPad, if you want to go to Florida for vacation, well, not these days, right? But if you want to go somewhere for vacation, right? You need to have money to do that. How do you get money? You have to work more, right? If you work more, you have less time to sit around, to sit on the couch, to watch ESPN, to sleep, to work out, right? So there's a trade-off, right? You're trading your leisure time, hanging out for work, and therefore you're trading leisure for consumption. What's the happy balance that people will strike so that they can make themselves as happy as they can? That's a trade-off, right? On a global scale or a national scale, right, to protect the environment, we need to use resources that we could otherwise use to produce stuff, right? So if we want to stop pollution or reduce pollution, we may tell factories to install a piece of equipment on their smokestacks to keep schmutz, to keep pollution from going into the air. That costs money. The money that the factory will spend to stop the pollution, they could have instead used to hire more workers or to buy a better machine, right? And they can use those workers or that better machine to make more stuff. So the choice is, if we want to stop pollution, we're telling factories essentially to make less stuff. There's a trade-off, right? So that is the core of economics. How do we balance these trade-offs, right? Are they worth it? How do we decide? How do we strike that balance? Can economics teach us anything about that at all, right? That's what we'll be talking about during the course of the semester and next semester also. Right? Principle number two, and we've seen this before, right? The cost of something is what you give up to get it. Does that sound familiar? That's our friend, the opportunity cost, which I talked about in the last set of slides, right? The cost of something usually is money, but sometimes it's something else, like time for a person, right? To make a decision, it helps to be able to compare the costs and benefits of different choices, right? So again, you're trying to decide whether to study or go or hang out, right? So the cost of studying is you're not able to hang out, but the benefit is you might get a higher grade, right? So is that extra, I don't know, 10 points on a test worth an hour of not hanging out? That's up to you, but you do face that trade-off and you do face that opportunity cost. This is the cost that economists care about. This is the most important cost that we rely on to make decisions. If you're a firm instead of a person, right, the trade-off you have is the resources you need to produce something, right? So you can decide, let's say Apple, for example. Well, no, forget about Apple. Think about Buddy, right? He's our example. So Buddy has a choice. He can make cakes or he can make cupcakes or pies. I like pies, right? So why Buddy's got a worker who's available for an hour. He's got an oven that's available to make the cakes. Should he be making cakes or should he be making cupcakes? How does he decide what to do, right? It has a lot to do with the the sales he can make from selling the pies or cupcakes or cakes, right? But he does face that opportunity cost of that choice, right? Does he make cakes? He can't make cupcakes. Is that a good idea? That's something we care about a lot about, right? If you're again back to you, if you're you, right? You're here or you're somewhere, but you're listening to me, right? You chose to take this course when instead you could be taking another course. You could be taking biology. You could be taking psychology, right? How do you decide? Why did you decide to take economics instead of psychology? Maybe because you need it for your major, right? Maybe, I think this is certainly true. It's more interesting than those silly biologists. What do they know, right? We're way more interesting than biologists. Maybe you think this is easier than another course that you might have taken. I don't know if you'll find out that soon enough, right? But the point is you made a choice to take this instead of something else, which also meant that you can't take that other thing, right? So is taking economics a better choice than taking biology, right? Or if you want to look at this from a higher level, is going to university, is coming to you, Albany, or listening to us from remotely from wherever you are, is that a better idea than for you to forget about college to begin with and go to work? Right? So there's a trade-off there. By going to university, you're less able to work. Is that a good idea? Is that a good trade-off? Because you are giving up the salary that you would earn by working. We like to think so, that going to university ultimately is a much better plan for your future. And there's lots of studies that support that, but that's a choice you made. Right? And you did have to give up that salary. Right? What else? People think at the margin. What in the world does that mean? Well, we'll find this, right? We make decisions by looking at the cost of something and the benefit of something. If we do one more of those things, we call those marginal changes, or small adjustments to your thinking process, right? So how does this work? That's a little vague at the moment. We'll flesh it out. But how does it work? Well, eventually, once you guys get to your senior year, you'll have a choice. Do I go to work? Or do I stick around for another year to get a master's degree? How would you make that calculation? Well, you go to work and you earn a salary, and that's great. But if you go continue with your education, get another master's, you'll A, give up that salary, but B, you'll have more skills and probably get a higher salary after you're done with your master's, right? So does that extra year worth it? How do you decide, right? What's another one? Do we eat that extra slice of pizza, or do you say, and if you do, you hope that you'll get more pleasure, happiness, utility out of that extra pizza, or you say, that's enough, right? I've got enough happiness out of eating these pizzas, and rather than eat that, I'd rather have the, I don't know, $2, whatever it is for a slice, right? How do you know, right? Do you study another hour, or do you take a nap, or you hang out with your friends? What's the trade-off there? And we're not talking about studying generally. We're talking about an extra hour, that one more little adjustment to your plan, right? So let's say you study for one of my exams, for my final exam, for 5 hours. The question is, do you study for 6 hours? Or is 5 hours enough? If you study it for 5 hours, maybe that's as prepared as you are. If you study for another hour, maybe your grade goes up by another 5 points. I don't know, right? But by studying for that extra hour, you give up something else, right? Is that extra hour worth the 5 points versus the pleasure that you get from doing something else, right? That's the balance that you have to make of the cost, right? The cost of giving up the something else, watching SportsCenter, and the benefit, the extra 5 points on your grade. All right. Here's a good example relating to cars, right? So you have a car, you have a used car, you want to sell it. Before you sold it, let's say 2 months ago, you put a new set of tires on it for $1,000, right? But then 2 months later, you decide to sell the car, and just as you're ready to put it up on Craigslist or wherever, right, the transmission dies. right? So you have a choice. You can sell the car with a dead transmission, or you can get the transmission repaired. If you get the transmission repaired, it'll cost you 600 bucks, right? So what do? Do you sell it as is, or do you get the car repaired and spend the 600 bucks? What do you need to know, right? What would you like to know? Well, there's a answer there. There's a question there, right? There's a question you should be asking yourself. What should you need to know to make that decision, right? It depends on what? Think about that for a second, right? It depends on how much you get for the car, whether it's with a dead transmission or a fixed transmission. So let's suppose, for example, that if you fix the car or you have a car with a transmission that works, right, you can get $6,500 for the car. But if you don't fix it, you'll get 5,700, right? So the difference there between a good car, a working car, and a dead transmission car is $800. On the other hand, a different set of facts, you can sell a car for $6,000, not $6,500, but $6,000 if the transmission works, but only $5,500 if it doesn't work, right? So the difference there between a good car and a dead car is $500. Does that help answer your question? It should, right? Because if you fix the transmission, right, remember it only costs you $600. In my first case, you get $800 for a better car. That sounds to me like you got a $200 profit by fixing the transmission. That sounds to me like you get the transmission fixed. On the other hand, if you fix the transmission, it still costs you $600, but in my second case, you only get $500 more for selling the car if it's fixed, right, versus selling a dead transmission car. That $500 is not enough to pay for the cost of fixing the transmission. So what do? Don't fix it. Let the next guy fix it, right? That's the kind of thought that you should be engaging in, right, when you're trying to decide this last decision, that marginal decision. Notice one thing. This is a different type. Notice one thing that we're not talking about. We're not talking about the tires, right? You already spent that. We call that a sunk cost. That's not relevant anymore. Put it out of your mind. What we only care about now is the cost and the benefit of the extra repair, the marginal cost of that transmission. That's what you need to know to make your decision, right? So what else? Principle number 4. People respond to incentives. What's that? An incentive is something that causes a person to act or encourages or induces a person to act or not act in a certain way, right? The reward, for example, right? The reward, a possibility of a reward or a punishment, right? So people respond to incentives. If I set up a set of rules that encourages you to behave in a certain way, you're more, and if you behave that way, something good will happen to you. And if you don't behave in that way, something bad will happen to you. What are you more likely to do as a human being? You're going to do something that you're going to behave the way I want. You're going to respond to that incentive, right? Like what? Well, we know if rational people, logical people, people who are thinking well, right, respond to incentives. What kind of incentive? Well, if you go to work, you'll get paid. That's an incentive. You behave the way I want. You come work for me. I will pay you. The incentive is the salary. The behavior is you working for me. So if you respond to that potential salary, you'll come work for me. If you're a business, right, the incentive is potential profit. Right? If you run the business and you sell a product that people want, you'll make a profit. So what might you do? You might run that business and make that product and make a profit. You're chasing that incentive. You're chasing that profit. You're responding to the incentive, right? What else? If you finish your college degree here at UAlbany, we know this is true, you'll earn a higher wage. So what might you do? You might finish. right? You're chasing that incentive, you're chasing that higher salary, right? You're behaving in a way that I want you to behave, which is to finish school. Now, before you say, what is this guy talking about? We know this is true. There's been a million studies by economists and other people who look at the difference in salary, not only per year, but during one's working life for different levels of education, right? Whether you're a high school graduate or a high school dropout, right? Or a high school graduate like you guys are, or a university graduate, or have a graduate degree or a professional degree like an MBA or a law degree, right? And we look at the different salaries that these folks earn, and as the conclusion always is, if you continue your education, you'll get a high salary. We call this the wage premium, the prize, right? So you need to decide whether that wage premium is enough to continue to work. And we know it's dangling out there, right? The incentive is a high salary if you work, if you go to school more, right? Is it worth it? Do you chase that incentive, right? If you do, you're doing you're doing the behavior that I want you to do, right? And so therefore, you're responding to that incentive, right? So that's principle number 4. That's it for this set of slides. We will be back to you soon with the rest of the 10, and we'll keep going. Thanks.